Hello and welcome back to Polytoots. In today's lesson we are going to be making a like a frost icicle hang shader. I'm not really sure what I'm going to title the video yet. Maybe just frost icicle, frosticicle, one of these things. But anyway, it's a nice little shader. We are going to be using the Amplify shader editor for this, mostly because the shader graph still does not support tessellation, which I kind of need for the ice hanging down, but it's a pretty simple shader. You should be able to follow along with shader graph for the most part. The other thing about this shader is that it will always point the ice down. That's pretty cool. You know, if you want to just rotate a bunch of props and whatnot, the ice will always face down. It is also worth mentioning before we begin that I've got the Warcraft Alliance statue model here from Sketchfab from a user called Atiander or something like that. I imagine that's some kind of anagram. But yeah, it's a free download and I will leave a link in the description if any of you want to check it out. It's pretty cool. There's a couple of other little things going on, but we will get to those during the tutorial, which I will start round about now. Okay, so here we are with the shaders wiped, so it's just some default materials on here. And the first thing we obviously want to do is go ahead and create ourselves a Amplify shader. You will need the Amplify package for this if it's not already obvious. We're going to create a Amplify shader. It's going to be a URP shader since I'm in a URP project. And I will just give this a name and open it up. And then just so I don't forget, up in the top left here for the shader name, I'll just put in a name which also acts as a directory. And now for the shader itself, the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to grab two textures and we're just going to lerp between them because this is ultimately the like the base of this whole shader. So I will be including a bunch of these textures with the download link over on my Patreon, but I won't be able to include the Alliance texture or model since that's not mine, but as I said, you can go and grab that from Sketchfab. So yeah, I'm just going to drag these textures in. We'll start with the base albedo, give that a name. And then I'm going to start with just my frost texture, which is just like a random free like tiling ice texture that I grabbed. And so after this, we just need to create a lerp. And as an aside, I'm sure many of you are already aware of this, but when you press the spacebar and search for something, if it has a little hotkey after it, like a letter or a number, that lets you know that in Amplify Shader Editor, you can hold down that hotkey and click with the mouse and it will just add it in. So for Lerp, it would just be an L and then we just click to add it. So we have that in there, and I'm also going to put down a float and I'll turn this into a slider by putting the max value as 1. And then we can just hook this together and see what this will do. It's essentially just, you know, a slider that will take us from one texture to another. And then, because I always forget, make sure we turn this float into a property. That way it's accessible on the material. So we'll just give this a little save, or a big save if you want, up to you. And we'll come over to where our shader is, and I'll select that and right click it, and then create a material from that. This way it automatically propagates the shader to the material. And since we dragged our textures in, it's automatically assigned them there. This doesn't always work, so make sure that you check to see if the textures are in the material or not. And then we'll just assign this to all of the models. And as you can see, if we move the slider, it's just, you know, very, very basic. It's just going from one to another. And if that's all you wanted to do, then, you know, congratulations. This is the end of the tutorial. Thank you for sticking around, and I will see you in the next one. But for everybody else, there's a little bit more that we can do. Let's come back to the shader now. And to begin with, I'm just going to create a register, just so we start off on the right foot here and make sure things are nice and tidy. And then I'm going to, using the G key and clicking, I'm going to get the get, which is like the opposite of a register. What we can do here is we can register this initial albedo setup, and then we can just get that elsewhere, you know, so we don't have to have all these lines going everywhere. And I will also just select all of these and press the C key to create this group, and I can give that a name so it's all nice and tidy. The next thing that we'll move on to will be the initial vertex displacement. And since we know that we want the icicles to always face down, we might as well start off with some world space masking, you know, some way to tell what is up and what is down. And to begin that, we'll start with a world normal node. And it's only the Y value that we want, since that is up and down. And if you can see here, when I put in a multiply, and I multiply that by 1, it's on the top. We want it on the bottom, so we're going to put in a minus value, and I think I end up with about minus 0.3. So we have something here that will, it's a mask we can use for the bottom of objects. But we need to be able to control the strength of this, and we're going to do that with the slider that we've already got. So we're going to put in a multiply, but then I'm going to come back up here to our ice slider, and I'm going to just register this so we can get this same slider, multiple points throughout the shader without having those lines going everywhere. So I'm just going to get our slider there and hook it into the multiply after our world normal. So we're controlling the strength of that mask. And then we're going to saturate. And for now, I'm just going to register this. So we have our mask registered as a value that we can reuse. We want to use this mask in tandem with the vertex offset because we want to be able to, extrude or expand out the bottom of our meshes. And for that, we will need the vertex normal node. But for now, let's just do the usual. I'll just select everything here, press the C key so we can create a group, and I'll just name this Y mask. And then we'll go and grab our vertex normal. And for now, just for the extreme basics, I'm just going to get the same Y mask and multiply it by that vertex normal. And I'm also going to register this and give that a name. And if you are completely new to Amplify Shader Editor and you're wondering why we're doing all of this registering and getting, it's essentially the same as, if I were to just take the end of this multiply and put it straight into the vertex offset, that's the same thing. The only difference here is I can move this whole system of nodes somewhere else and just basically teleport the end result to somewhere else. I'm sure that was probably obvious and I didn't need to explain it, but there we are. So for now, super basic setup. We're just vertex normal, multiply by our Y mask, and we will just go see how that looks. And as you can see, we do have the bulge, and it is bulging on the bottom, most sort of evident on the sphere. We can tell, on the alliance mesh there, it is affecting something. It wouldn't necessarily, I think, be obvious that it was only affecting the bottom Y, but that's why we have our little sphere and capsule in the scene just to verify these things. And of course, if you were to rotate this mesh, the texture and everything is still moving and rotating, but our offset is staying down, which is correct. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to grab a new texture, and this one again will be available for download. And this is just it's a little mask I've created. The idea is just to create some sort of noise to offset by, so we're not always offsetting by a uniform amount, because these icicles are supposed to be, very jaggedy, sort of, up and down, which is why I wanted this mask. And you can create this kind of mask in the shader itself, but I figured it was probably just cheaper to have a little texture. So I'm going to drag this in. And for now, I'm going to do this a bit of an incorrect way, because we know that we want to use this mask, this texture mask, in conjunction with our Y mask. But if I were to just hook this up now, so I'm going to multiply our ice mask texture here with the Y mask that we've generated from the world normal. So we're just going to multiply these together, and I'm going to put that in, and I'm going to show you why you probably don't want to do it this way. So let's just save that out and come to our material. Don't forget to assign the texture. Sometimes they just, they're not automatically assigned even if you drag them into the editor. As we can see, there is some sort of effect happening, but not entirely. And basically what's happening here is we've got a world normal that is telling our objects to do a vertex offset on the minus Y, so it's on the bottom. But then we're trying to use that with a mask to say, well, please, offset in this weird way, like mask it by this texture. But the texture is using UV space. So as we rotate this object, you can tell that the frost texture is moving. And so too is our icicle mask texture. That is rotating around the object with it because it's using UV space. So if that texture doesn't line up with the world normal on the bottom, then we're not going to get any ice coming out. So obviously we need to fix this because we always want the icicles to be there. No matter how you rotate the object, the icicle should always be down. So we need to create some more world space UVs basically. And we're going to reuse the world normal node that we have here. And then we'll grab an append node and we'll set it to a vector 2. and append the X and the Z into the X and Y of the append. And this is basically just your bog standard top-down world projection texture mapping. And I'm going to multiply this by a float, which will be the tiling amount of our texture. And I am going to turn this into a slider. I know that's a bit weird because normally you would never want a tiling of 0 on your texture, but we are just using this as a mask and it looks okay. So for me, I'm keeping this as a slider. You obviously can do whatever you want. So anyway, we'll hook that in. And these are now our UVs. So we're going to just put that into the UV slot of our icicle mask texture. We do also want to offset this a bit because by default, if you can imagine our texture being on a plane, currently with the world space mapping, it's going to not always appear in the center, which is why I'm introducing this offset. So our texture should always appear in the center now. And it's an offset of 0.5. And as usual, let's register this. And then before, where we were multiplying in just the texture as a test, we can grab a get node, change it to the ice mask that we just made, offset mask, and stick that into the multiply. And so let's just save this out and just have a quick look at the difference. So there's still something a little bit strange happening here. And there's two things we can do about this. First of all, we should introduce tessellation at this point. So in the Amplify shader editor, we can just enable tessellation. I'm going to change mine to a distance-based. So after we've done that, you can see that we have spiky icicles. But the other thing is our tiling probably needs a bit of adjustment. And as usual, I forgot to make this float into a property. So we'll change that now, which means we can access it on the material now. And by changing the tiling of our ice texture, we can obviously change, dramatically change the look of our icicles. And just to make it easier to see, I'm going to chuck on a checker texture here, just to show what the next problem is we're going to tackle. You can see here that as we adjust our ice slider, it's pulling our geometry down, and it's warping the actual mesh because, that is what it's doing. It's just grabbing our mesh and pulling it down. Whereas what I want to happen is, this ice starts to form, so we shouldn't really see our geometry warp like this. Instead, anything that extrudes down should just be pure ice. We don't want to see any weird warping of a texture or of a model. We just want to see new ice being formed. So that's what we'll work on next. So okay, back to the shader editor, and I'm just going to do a little bit of a tidy up here. So, create a group, give it a name, move some things around. And one thing that I will also do is I'm going to just get the ice slider here again and just feed that back into where the original one was before. So I could just grab our original and the original register and just hoof that off to the side there just to keep it neat and tidy. This hasn't changed anything at all. Like the logic is still here. We're still using an ice slider there. This is just for tidiness sake. Although to confuse you a bit more, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to feed that get into a multiply. So I'm going to take it out of the alpha. And I'm going to change this, and this is quite important if you're following along. I'm going to change this get to use our Y mask. So this is no longer using the ice slider. We're now pulling the reference from our Y mask. And we're going to multiply this by a very strong value. It's going to be, I think a value of 8 was what I ended up with. And we're going to saturate that. There is a way, a shortcut key, I can't remember it though, to get blank slots like this to show you what the number is, but I can't remember what it is. So I've just created a float here, and I've given that the number 8, and it's just a constant, so it doesn't exist in the material. And I've hooked that in. This just helps for screenshots and things. It helps me remember what number I was using, because again, I can't remember how to display it in the editor. But anyway, that's enough rambly. We're going to use this as our new alpha, and we're going to take a look at what's going to happen. And what is going to happen, of course, is we're going to get the frost only on the bottom because that's what we're telling it to do with our new Y mask that we're using for our get. And so as we adjust the slider, you can see we're only getting the frost on the bottom, but we're no longer really seeing that geometry warp anymore. It's becoming sort of overpowered by the frost. So we're not seeing, we're not seeing the base texture get pulled down. It's just immediately turning to frost, that's it, that's what we want. The problem now, of course, is we've lost our frost on the top. So what we're going to do is we'll come back to the editor and we'll create a lerp after the initial lerp in our albedo. And from here, we're going to put the current setup into the A slot of our lerp. And we just want to put our ice texture into the B slot. And you can either do this by just dragging that ice texture across, or just because I haven't shown it yet, what you can do is create another texture sample and just use that as a reference to that other texture. But we don't need to do that, so I'm going to stick with the original ice texture for now. And then for our alpha, we will use the ice slider again and put that into the final register. So now if we go and have a look, there, so now we have our frost back on top, and we can see that as the frost comes down underneath, again, we're not seeing so much, at least, of that base texture being warped down. It's immediately turning to ice. So just as a little comparison here, if I were to get rid of that multiply, you can see there how the texture is being pulled. Like we can see it happening as that ice slider moves, which for you, that might be okay. For me, I wanted something a bit more frosty this winter. And actually, while we're here, one cheeky little thing we can do is we can grab our ice slider again and just stick that straight into the smoothness slot. Now, this is mostly because I'm not using a smoothness texture. If you were, you could just do, a lerp between the base smoothness and what you want the new smoothness to be. But for us, for now, for the tutorial at least, this will do just fine. And so just a quick little test, obviously, as we can see, if we adjust the ice slider, things start to get more shinier. But it is looking a little bit flat, so I would like now to just introduce the normal maps. And so all I'm going to do here, it's extremely simple, even more simple, I would say, than the albedo. I'm going to grab our normal maps, or if you want, just use a texture sample node. But I'm just going to drag them straight in, so it creates the texture sample node automatically. One thing to watch out for though, if you're not dragging in textures of normal maps specifically, make sure you remember to enable the unpack normal map option. By default, when I drag a normal map in, it will enable that. But if you're creating your own texture sample, then by default that is off. So something to watch out for sure. You need that to be ticked on if it's a normal map. And so yeah, from here we'll just create a lerp and we'll use our ice slider as the alpha, and that's it, very, very simple. We're just going from one normal map to the other as the ice progresses. And as usual, we'll register this, create groups, and hook it all up. And we'll go and see what that looks like. Don't forget, of course, to assign the textures if they haven't already been assigned automatically. Otherwise, nothing's going to work. Everything just looks a little bit better with normal maps, I think. But at the same time, if you're not using any in your project, but you still want this effect, then, just don't include the normal map part and you'll be fine. We've only got a couple more things to go. One is going to be the light passing through the icicles. Another is I do want some frost on the top to be extruding the mesh just a tiny bit, because, this is layering on quite thick. So I do want a little bit of extrusion on the top. And then we're going to introduce things like a little bit of Fresnel or color tints. And then I think that's pretty much it. So we're going to carry on, and what we will be tackling next will be the extrusion on the top. We already have an area here for our Y mask using the world normal, and you might be thinking that we could just use something like a 1- on the mask that we already have, but I do want this new mask to be a bit more stronger because, our underneath mask is of a value of about -0.3, and the top mask, I actually want to boost that to be quite strong. So I'm going to throw in a multiply, still multiply by the Y of our world normal, and I'm going to use a value of about 3, I think. And then I'm going to saturate this so we don't blow everything out. Saturate will basically, it just acts as a clamp almost. And as usual, we're going to just register this and give it a name. In this case, it's the Y mask for the top. So now we have a mask for the top of our mesh, and we need to introduce it into the vertex offset somewhere. So I'm going to just give ourselves a little bit more space here. So we'll just grab a get node, and we'll get our Y mask for the top. And for now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use an add, and I'm going to add this straight into the equation and feed it into the vertex normal, so we can see what's going to go wrong. As you can see, things are a little bit crazy. Like if you were in the market for some sort of procedural mushroom, then, you might be doing all right here, but we do not want this kind of effect happening. So there's two things that we need to address. One, of course, is that we need to control it with a slider, and the other is that it needs to not be so crazy. The first problem, of course, is very easy to solve. We just want to grab our ice slider, and we'll just multiply that with our Y mask top value. which of course means that we can control this with the slider, but it's still just absolutely crazy. So we also need to massively reduce the power of this Y top mask. And there's a few ways to do this. The reason we're not doing it immediately straight out of where we are multiplying with the world normal on the Y is that's not controlling the power, that's just controlling the distance covered, I suppose. Because remember, we put it into the minus to go underneath, so it's just moving up and down. So you could use a multiply after you've registered, or what we're going to do is just remap the ice slider before we multiply it with our Y top mask, essentially reducing the power of this slider, but only for the Y top mask. And I think for my remap, I use a new value of about 0.1. I say about, I mean it's on screen. It's exactly 0.01. Now, as you can see, like it's very, very subtle. I wouldn't blame you at all if you don't want to bother with this bit, but to me, it just adds that little extra bit of that oomph, you know. Okay, so moving on to the emission portion where we want more light coming from these icicles, I'm going to use a texture sample node, and I'm going to set the mode to a reference, and then set the reference to the frost texture. So this will just grab the same texture that we're using there. And then I'm going to multiply this with a Fresnel node. And for me, the settings that I ended up with was I put the scale to 3 and I halved the power, but feel free to change these to whatever it is you want. The Fresnel will basically just give us a nice bit of rim lighting, and it's pretty important for lighting up where the icicles are hanging down, because that is, you know, nothing but rim. That's a weird sentence. Anyway, we're going to multiply this again, and this time with our ice slider. So now, of course, you know, this is the slider that controls everything. We'll just put in another multiply, and we'll multiply this by a color. And again, don't forget to set this to a property. This is essentially the color tint of your ice. And then we'll come down to the master slot here, or master whatever it is, and we'll just get the emission and plug it straight into the emission slot. Also, don't forget, I guess it would help if your default color was white. That way, when you first create a material, it's not going to be, you know, completely black. And if we see what this looks like, it's you can already tell, you know, where those icicles are coming down. It's a lot brighter than the rest of it, which is pretty nice. And we have that nice Fresnel rim lighting as well, and we can control the color. And ultimately, it's just, you know, I think it's a bit of an improvement over the original, which was quite dull, quite dark. You could, if you wanted to, use this area to also introduce bits of light sparkles or something, you know, either with a new texture of just lots of little white dots, or, you know, if you had an animated noise that kind of just popped in and out. Something, I guess, maybe a bit more stylized, you know, ice, how we kind of see it in cartoons and whatnot. This would probably be where you'd want to do that. We are very nearly done. There's just one little thing that I wanted to add in right at the end here, and it's the ability to control the icicles while still keeping the frost, because I realized later on that perhaps, you know, you might want some objects covered in frost and ice, but you don't necessarily want to, you know, hammer out all of this tessellation in the object and have all of these icicles coming down. And rather than having two shaders, I figured I would just move it into one. Although I should clarify, it's almost certainly going to be more optimal to do this as two shaders if you just wanted, you know, one area of your level or whatever to just have some frost without any icicles hanging down. Because then you don't have to worry about all of this stuff that's in this shader, like all of the tessellation and whatever else is happening. You can just have, you know, a lerp between two textures, basically, and some smoothness. So yeah, I'm just mentioning that. But anyway, back to the idea of being able to control the icicles independently. We're just going to come here to our vertex offset, and we're going to introduce another multiply here before our add. So it's before we introduce the top mask. And I'm just going to create a new float. And this is going to be our, you know, the icicle length. And again, I set this to a slider, and then just hook that into the multiply that feeds into that add, and make sure that it is set to a property. I do take the opportunity here to just rearrange the material layout here. So now if we take, suppose, one final look at this, we can see that we have our frost there, and there's no icicles because we can control those independently. But The nice thing about the way that we've set it up here is the ice slider, like the master slider we have, still controls the ice length. So ultimately it means, you know, if your ice amount is 0, then you're not going to get any icicles hanging down anyway. But if your ice amount, or, you know, the frost amount is set to 1, you can still control the icicles independently. So I thought that was pretty nice. Nice little addition, bit of flexibility on how you wanted to use it. And that pretty much wraps up the entire tutorial. There is just one caveat that you need to watch out for, and that is to do with the vertex offset, in that it will only work correctly if the normals of your mesh all have the same normal amount, basically. So, you know, in your 3D application, if your smoothing groups are set to, you know, the same all over, if you have a facetted mesh, for example, if I were to just go and change the import settings of the statue, you can see that anywhere where there's a hard edge now, it will break. So I probably should have mentioned this earlier on, but I completely forgot about it. And now that I'm looking at the video, I can see that I added it at the end. But yeah, just something to watch out for. If you have a facetted mesh, then, you know, it is going to pull apart at the, not the seams per se, but it will pull apart on hard edges. If anybody knows of a workaround for this, then feel free to share it in the comments. But other than that, I thank you very much for watching. I thank all of my patrons for your lovely, lovely support, and hopefully this year can be a little bit better than 2020. I suppose we'll see. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. Again, I know I always end up saying that twice, but it is what it is. I will see you in the next one.